In this part of the video, I'm just going to be talking about the final touches. I'm going to be painting in the lower half of the bust, and I'm just zooming out a little bit to make sure everything reads correctly from a small size. And you can also see it from the navigator window up there, what it looks like at a smaller size, just to make sure my values and everything are reading well. So I'm kind of just searching around for what I want to work on, and I'm thinking that over here below the breast I can add a little bit more of a harder edge, and then soften it as it goes up into the chest. So now continuing down to the abs. So jumping around again. I usually jump around my painting a lot. I kind of like to work up most of my painting at the same time instead of completely rendering out the head and then moving down and completely rendering out, the hand or something. And for the most part now, I'm not really choosing colors from the color palette. I'm pretty much just color picking from values that are already established in my painting. Trying to fix the reflected light down here. I'm zooming in a little bit just because this is a small area and it's kind of hard to paint that small when you're zoomed out, especially since the cursor kind of goes over your brush, so it's kind of hard to see. I'm just adding in this sharper cast shadow. And I'm using the round brush. And then as the shadow goes away, it's going to turn into a softer edge. Just reinstating some of these darks over here. Zoom back out. Just going in and making these a little bit darker again. Making my brush smaller so I can get that harder edge. And then making the brush larger as I go out and painting with less pressure so I get a softer edge. Same as over here, you're going to have the harder edge. Then as you move away, it's going to get softer. So again, changing my brush back to the chalk brush to get that softer edge. Now I'm going to start painting in the form of the hips a little bit. Trying to think of them as large planes. So using a large chalk brush just to mark in that large plane area. Again, painting the background around the shapes to kind of chisel in the body. So as you make plane changes, you're also going to make value changes. So over here, this plane was closer to the light, so it's going to be lighter. Again, over here, this shadow shape behind the abs, that's where you have the overlapping shapes. If you'll notice, it goes into shadow, and then in the very back, it goes back into light again, and that's due to plane changes in the body. The different planes at different angles are catching different amounts of light. So over here, I have a nice hard edge where the belly button is. So yeah, this is the dark area that I was talking about that goes into shadow, and then behind that, it goes into light again. So if you've noticed, I haven't really corrected my drawing too often with, like I guess you would call it a digital means, like selecting something and then rotating it. I've done that a couple times, but for the most part, I'm making changes by just repainting areas or painting the background around the shapes to correct edges. So a lot of this is just from a traditional standpoint of how I would correct things. So down here, as the leg comes out, I'm going to have a harder edge, and it's going to be a lot lighter because this area is moving out and catching more light. Actually, going to open the brush palette, and I'm going to change the angle of the brush so that it goes in the direction that the leg is going in. So I'm painting around as if I was painting a cylinder, I guess. Just going to throw in a little bit of highlight down here. Going in and adding in some of the darks, fixing some of my shapes. And now I'm just going to paint in the background. Basically, I'm painting the negative space to create the positive space on the leg. And this area is just going to fade off into a soft edge. Same with down here. As the leg rolls around into darkness, just getting softer. Trying to get a few little variations from the plane changes down here. I don't want to go too crazy with the little details because I don't want it to get too busy. I'm trying to just pick out the main large shapes. Just scribbling around, trying to be a little loose with the painting. When I was talking earlier about not painting too many little details, you also want to realize that even though you're working from a photo reference, you don't have to be a slave to your reference. Realize that you are an artist and you have artistic license, and a lot of times you need to edit your painting or your photo ref in order to work more successfully as an illustration. So, for example, if you're painting someone that's wearing a coat and his arm is bending, and in the photo reference there's 30 little folds, you're probably not going to want to paint every single fold in your painting because it's unrealistic in terms of the time it's going to take. It might not look as nice. Like maybe you're trying to paint someone from higher society that's supposed to look a little more upscale, and typically their suits aren't going to have tons and tons of tiny little folds. It's going to make them look a little more frumpy. So instances like that, you're going to want to edit your painting just to be more successful. And I'm doing this kind of the same thing with this painting. I'm editing and simplifying some of the shapes just to make them look a little bit better, and so that they're not quite as busy. Because if you look over here in this area in the reference, there's tons of little areas where there are plane changes. There's lots of little light and dark areas. It has a little bit of a puckered look, I guess, because there's so many changes in value. And so I'm just looking at the main ones and breaking it down into those. So again, here you have these little plane changes. You're going to have them going into shadow. And then as the plane changes, you're going to have areas of light, which are going to create a sharper edge. So again, as I'm painting these, I'm not really thinking about what muscles they are so much as opposed to the shapes that they make. So I think breaking it down and thinking of things in terms of shapes will help you with your painting so that it's not quite as daunting, I guess, with the prospect of having to paint a realistic person. So when you break things down into shapes, then you can start thinking of what the shape looks like, thinking about the core shadow, the cast shadow, the specular highlight. And when you break it down into technical things like that, it might be a little bit easier to handle. The other thing I tend to forget to do a lot of times when I'm working from photo reference is I don't flip my canvas as much. So yeah, I'm just flipping it to check things. I guess because I have the reference in front of me, I know what things are supposed to look like, so I don't have to flip my canvas as much. But when I'm working from imagination, I need to make sure that my painting looks correct from different angles. So looking back at it now, I'm noticing a few little things that I could fix, like the very left edge of the painting, her stomach. On the reference, it's more of a diagonal. In mine, it kind of dips in a little too much and then comes back out too much, if that makes any sense. So over here on the thigh, just trying to add in a few little muscle shapes here and there. But again, not trying to get too detailed. I'm gonna leave most of it pretty loose. And I'm probably just gonna let it fade off like this instead of actually painting an ending containing shape, I guess. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how I want to end that part of the painting. Again, just correcting the outside edges. You can't really even see them in the photo reference, but I can see it in life. I'm just adding a little bit of a core shadow in here, just to give it a little more form. So at this point, I'm just going back and looking at areas that I could push the shadows and the highlights, and just trying to find areas that look a little flat so that I can push some of the form. And I'm also looking for any drawing corrections I need to make, softening up edges, making some edges a little bit harder. Trying to add in that overlapping shape that I was talking about earlier. The shape that goes behind it is going to be a little bit softer and go off in shadow. Again, these overlapping shapes can really help create a three-dimensional form. So just pushing some of these highlights a little more just to make things pop. Adding in the hard and soft edges. So if you squint, a lot of my values aren't as dark as the photo reference. They're more in line with what I'm seeing in life. So over here I'm just pushing these shadow shapes a little more, even though they're not as dark on the reference, just to make the shoulder pop a little bit more. Gonna add this specular down here. And again, some of these aren't going to be as drastic on a real person because the materials are different. Since this is a bust, it's a harder material that's more reflective than skin. Just trying to add in some of these details over in the armpit. Getting a variety of the hard and soft edges that I keep talking about. Right now I'm pretty much just in autopilot mode, going around adding in darker areas, stronger highlights, trying to fix shapes, just very minimal changes. It's pretty much finished. I'm just trying to give it a little bit of extra polish. Like the shadow shape back here was a little too dark. It's drawing a little too much attention. And this neck up here, the angle is a little off. But I think the main thing to remember and take away from this is to break things down into shapes and think of each shape in terms of the core shadow, the cast shadow, the highlights. And remember your edges, your edge control, soft and hard edges. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit over here again, just because it's hard to paint this cast shadow and reflected light because it's so small. So when you zoom in, a lot of times you'll notice that your shapes and things are off a little bit, like they're off register, just because you're trying to paint zoomed out and you think that you're painting in a certain area, but when you zoom in, you'll notice that you're actually not. So sometimes I zoom in just to fix those things. So up here on the neck, I'm just adding in a few little scribbles and things just to give the surface a little bit of texture, reinstating these sharp highlights just to give that idea of the hard edge. Back to the round brush, painting in a few of the cracks and things on the arm just to show that this is a man-made object and it's not a real person. Going in very softly and adding in the darker area where the armpit is, the overlapping shapes. Yeah, that's another thing to remember when you're painting, is overlapping shapes. And if you haven't noticed already, this was all filmed in real time, and I think it took me about 45 minutes to do this painting. And I always try to film everything in real time just because it's hard to see what people are doing when it's sped up to, 3 or 4 times speed, or sometimes even more than that. Just flipping my canvas again, trying to make sure my shapes look correct. Just gives me a new perspective on what my painting looks like. Just making some of these coarse shadows and things a little bit darker. Adding in a few little highlights on the leg, but I don't want them to be as bright as the highlights on the shoulder. So that's pretty much it, and I'm just going to zoom in so that you can see what my brushwork looks like a little more easily. So if you'll notice, everything's actually really loose when you zoom in. And that's about it. So if you have any comments or questions or want to post your work, just leave me some comments. Thanks a lot.